saw that. Brick killed a guy.
House of the Dragon, the return to Westeros for the first time since Game of Thrones ended in 2019. I was initially skeptical of jumping back into a Song of Ice and Fire universe after the epically botched ending of Game of Thrones, but House of the Dragon was a return to form. In many ways, Season 1 of House of the Dragon felt like Season 1 of Game of Thrones. We've returned to a morally grey world where good people do bad things in the name of duty and honor, where heroes and villains are on all sides of the conflict and no one is safe. This is only the beginning of a long and fruitful expansion into the Game of Thrones lore for HBO. It's essentially the first chapter of what could be a relatively long story. And the good news is that, unlike Game of Thrones, this story has an ending written by George R.R. Martin. But as good as Season 1 of House of the Dragon was as a standalone product, it highlighted the glaring issues of how Game of Thrones ended. The added history and context to this world makes Game of Thrones worse, not better, and it reopened the wound of disappointment left by the original show.
But that's the last straw.
House of the Dragon takes place 200 years before the events of Game of Thrones, which is just over 100 years after Aegon's conquest. It's a world where the Targaryens and their dragons are still the unquestioned leaders of Westeros, with the support of most of the realm. The story of the show comes from George R.R. Martin's history book, Fire and Blood. It details the lead up to the Targaryen civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. This war is cited as being responsible for the death of most of the living dragons of the time. Season 1 gives us the context for that eventual war. King Viserys naming his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir, Rhaenyra's multiple marriages and parentage of her children, and the eventual usurping of her throne by Alicent Hightower and the Small Council. When it was at its best, Game of Thrones was more a character-driven political drama than anything else. House of the Dragons returns to that theme from its very first episode. As great as the early seasons of Game of Thrones were, there was no debate on which side the viewer was supposed to take. The Starks, Daenerys, and Tyrion were always meant to be the main characters of the show. In House of the Dragon, this isn't the case. We have the Greens and the Blacks, with ambitious schemers on all sides. Sure, Rhaenyra might be the rightful queen, but it's hard to root for one side over the other when baby killing is very much on the table for both of them. This was perfectly represented in the final 2 episodes, as the writers show us both sides of the conflict.
You're stuck in this world of good and bad?
Yeah.
This is history, man.
Yeah.
House of the Dragon Season 1 is already hitting many of the same notes that made Game of Thrones so popular. The scheming, backstabbing, and cringe-inducing incest are all there, as are the references to the mystical villain that eventually attacked the realm in Game of Thrones. But it's that last part where House of the Dragon makes Game of Thrones look worse. The Song of Ice and Fire, the name of George R.R. Martin's book series on which Game of Thrones was based. We see Aegon the Conqueror's dream and the Song of Ice and Fire mentioned several times throughout House of the Dragon. By themselves, they're cool references to a story that, when fully told, is much more important than the petty infighting that's about to commence. When you consider these references with the context of how Game of Thrones ended, though, they only serve as a reminder of how bad that story ended up being. The rushed ending that made little contextual sense, the one-dimensional Ice King that turned a grey story into one of good and evil, Daenerys' 180 turn into a mad sadist with no groundwork for that shift, and overall, a bastardization of my favorite fantasy series of all time.
If you could describe the season finale of Game of Thrones in one word, how would you describe it?
Disappointing.
I was originally worried that House of the Dragon would follow the same path that Game of Thrones did. I have trust issues with this universe, and just because something started as a great show doesn't mean it'll end that way. The more I thought about it though, the more my worries were tempered. First and foremost, House of the Dragon has an ending. Game of Thrones, at the time of making this video, is still waiting on 2 more books to finish the series. Game of Thrones Season 1 and much of Season 2 were nearly shot-for-shot remakes of what happened in the books. They skipped over some small stuff, but it was a faithful adaptation of George R.R. Martin's writings. That was until they got to the storylines that Martin hadn't wrapped up. In the writer's defense, the show started in 2011. They probably assumed they'd have more source material to draw from over the next 8 years. But here we are in 2022 with the same number of Song and Ice and Fire books we had back then. The ending of Martin's books will probably look something like the ending of the show, with Daenerys turning crazy and burning down King's Landing, but it will make a whole lot more sense. And the storyline with the White Walkers will almost certainly be more nuanced than the Tolkien-esque conflict we got in the show. But in the end, Game of Thrones' faults came down to the fact that the writers didn't have the capacity to create their own engaging story. They used Martin's writings to make Game of Thrones a success and then failed when they ran out of source material.
You want to tell me about her? No, I don't think I will.
House of the Dragon, thankfully, doesn't seem to be in line to inherit these same issues. As I've said, this story has an ending for the writers to work towards, which is already a leg up on its predecessor. More than that is that the book on which House of the Dragon was based, Fire and Blood, is written as an account of history rather than a novel. It's written from the perspective of a maester, recording the events for future generations. That being the case makes the narrator of the book inherently unreliable. He has his own biases, and he can only tell parts of the story based on accounts from other people, who could be lying or mistaken. House of the Dragon is, instead, a narrative telling of those events rather than a third-party account. Through the show, we're learning what actually happened to these historical characters rather than just rumors and hearsay from the history books. It also means that the writers aren't following a predetermined narrative structure like the writers of Game of Thrones were, giving them the opportunity to tell their own story with the outline provided by this fictional historian. Despite this optimism, the references to Aegon's dream, the prince who was promised, and the Song of Ice and Fire in House of the Dragon only serve as a reminder of how badly Game of Thrones ended. By being as good as it is, House of the Dragon is retroactively making Game of Thrones a worse show. If the previous series had a shocking, bittersweet conclusion, these references would be an amazing way to tie both shows together. As it stands, with Game of Thrones ending being so bad, I wish House of the Dragon would just ignore its predecessor and act as a standalone show. House of the Dragon helps put the disappointing ending of Game of Thrones behind us. I wish they'd just keep it there rather than bringing it up over and over.
What they see is just the end of the Dothraki, essentially.
But the good news is that House of the Dragon was great, and it gives me hope for other stories from Westeros that HBO is considering adapting. Dunk and Egg, which also doesn't have an ending, Aegon's Conquest, Robert's Rebellion, and the Blackfire Rebellion could provide us with decades worth of new content from the Song of Ice and Fire universe, and I'm here for it, something I couldn't say before season 1 of House of the Dragon. Of course, that's just my take. If you disagree, let me know in the comments. If you made it this far, do me a favor and like the video. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.